All right, so we're diving deep today into broadhead lethality for big game. This is something you've been really interested in, and we're really excited to crack open Dr. Ed Ashby's 2004 study with you.
Yeah, definitely a fascinating one.
Yeah. Specifically, we're looking at the updated Part 1 report. And this research uses Asian buffalo as the test subject.
Right, and you're interested in how these findings apply to hunting in general.
Exactly.
All kinds of big game.
Yeah. So, I mean, this report, it's dense. It is packed with data. So we're going to do our best to extract the most relevant insights, the stuff that you really need to know, and really focus on what makes a broadhead truly effective when it comes to bringing down big game. So I guess to set the scene a little bit, we've got this researcher, Dr. Ashby. He's out there testing dozens of broadhead types,
Oh, yeah.
different arrow setups, even different bows.
She was thorough.
Yeah. To try to find the most lethal combinations. No stone unturned.
I think what's really impressive is his choice of the Asian buffalo as the test subject? I mean, these animals are renowned for their toughness.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they exceed even Cape buffalo. We're talking about skin that can be a full inch thick
Wow.
on a mature bull, and rib bones that average over a quarter-inch thick. So that's serious testament to the penetrating power of any setup.
Yeah, so essentially, if a broadhead can punch through an Asian buffalo,
Yeah.
it's safe to say it can handle pretty much anything else you throw at it.
You got it. Yep. The Asian buffalo definitely sets a very high bar when it comes to penetration. And I think the insights from this study
Yeah,
can be really broadly applied.
that's good to know.
Yeah.
That's reassuring. All right, so let's talk about serrated edges. I've always been curious about those.
Yeah.
Do they really make a difference? I mean, when it comes to cutting through that tough hide,
Yeah.
you see all these broadheads with those jagged edges. Do those really make a difference?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that Dr. Ashby specifically addressed in his research. And what he found might surprise you. The data actually showed that hill-style serrations, the kind that we often see on broadheads, were actually less effective than a smooth, honed edge.
Wait, really? So
Yeah.
you're telling me those serrations, I always just assumed they'd be ripping and tearing through hide like a chainsaw?
Yeah, it seems intuitive,
Yeah, but
but the study found that those serrations, they would have clogged up with the tough fibers of that buffalo hide.
oh, wow.
And that actually hindered their cutting ability.
Interesting.
Yeah. And in fact, honed and stropped edges penetrated 26% deeper than filed edges and a whopping 46% deeper than serrated edges. And this held true across various broadhead designs.
Wow, that's a pretty significant difference.
It is.
So it's not just about sharpness then, it's also about having that clean, smooth edge that can slice through.
That's exactly right. Yeah, the research strongly suggests that a smoothly honed edge is really key for optimal penetration,
Okay.
regardless of the broadhead design.
All right, so that's something to keep in mind when we're choosing broadheads.
Yeah.
Right? Now, I know you're eager to get into this. This age-old debate of heavy arrows versus light arrows.
Always a hot topic.
This study dives into that as well, right?
It does. It does. And there are some really fascinating findings there. So Dr. Ashby compared heavy, slower arrows with light, fast arrows. And what he discovered kind of challenges some conventional wisdom.
Okay, I'm all ears. What did the data reveal?
Well, you might assume that the light arrows, with their higher velocity and kinetic energy, would have the upper hand when it came to penetration.
Yeah, more speed, more power. Makes sense.
Exactly. But here's the twist. The heavy arrows consistently outperformed the light ones,
Really?
often penetrating significantly deeper, sometimes over 130% more.
Hold on. Are you saying a slower, heavier arrow can actually penetrate deeper than a faster, lighter one?
Yeah.
How is that possible?
Yeah, it was a head scratcher for many.
I-
But the science behind it is actually pretty compelling. We'll get into the specifics a little bit later. But for now, let's just say that momentum plays a crucial role in this equation.
Okay, all right. You've piqued my curiosity. Now, before we dive into all that physicsy stuff, let's talk about broadhead design.
Sure.
Did the study highlight any particular styles or features that stood out in terms of performance?
Absolutely. Dr. Ashby tested a wide range of broadhead types, replaceable blades, mechanicals, cut-on impact designs. And it was really interesting. The replaceable blade broadheads often showed signs of damage during testing, which might suggest that they need even higher impact force to really be reliable on tough game, like the Asian buffalo.
So maybe not the ideal choice for those thick hides and dense bones.
Yeah, the data seems to indicate that. Now, the real star performer was a modified grizzly broadhead with a 1-inch cutting width.
Okay.
It consistently outperformed both wider and narrower designs.
That's interesting. Why would a narrower broadhead perform worse? I would think it would encounter less resistance.
Yeah, it's a logical assumption. But what the study found was that those narrower broadheads, they didn't create a wide enough wound channel in the hide. And that actually increased drag on the arrow shaft and reduced penetration.
Interesting. So it's kind of a balance between creating enough of a wound channel to reduce drag, but not making the cutting surface so wide that it hinders the arrow's ability to get in there deep.
Exactly. And remember, this was all tested on Asian buffalo with their exceptionally thick hides.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the surprising ineffectiveness of serrated edges, the unexpected power of heavy arrows, and this sort of optimal broadhead width for penetration. Now I'm dying to know why those heavy arrows were punching above their weight class, despite having less kinetic energy.
Yeah, well, hold on tight because we're about to get into the fascinating world of aerophysics.
All right, let's do it.
All right, so let's break down why those heavy arrows performed so well, even with less initial speed. And it really comes down to the difference between kinetic energy and momentum. Kinetic energy is that energy of motion. It's that burst of power at the moment of impact.
Okay, so that would make sense why we'd initially think faster arrows would penetrate deeper, more of that initial energy.
Right, exactly. But kinetic energy, while crucial at the start, it's not the whole story. Momentum, on the other hand, is a measure of an object's mass in motion. Think of it as the tendency of an object to resist changes in its motion. So a heavy arrow, by virtue of its mass, has more momentum.
Okay, so a heavier arrow wants to keep moving forward, more so than a lighter arrow. But how does that translate to better penetration through something as tough as an Asian buffalo?
So imagine this. The heavy arrow hits the target, and because of its momentum, it doesn't slow down as quickly as a lighter arrow would. It just keeps pushing forward, transferring its energy into the target for a longer period. And that sustained force is what allows it to overcome the resistance of that thick hide and bone.
Ah, I see. So it's not just about that initial punch. It's about maintaining that force throughout the entire penetration process. That's why those heavy arrows, even though they were slower, were able to drive deeper. They had the momentum to power through.
Exactly. It's like the difference between a hammer tap and a steady push. The hammer might have a higher initial force, but it's that steady push that ultimately drives the nail in.
That's a great analogy. So when it comes to big game hunting, where deep penetration is so essential for a quick, clean, ethical kill, it seems like momentum is the key factor to prioritize.
Absolutely. And remember, Dr. Ashby's findings apply to all big game, not just Asian buffalo.
Right. If it can bring down an animal as tough as an Asian buffalo, it's a pretty safe bet it can handle other species as well.
Yeah.
Now, the study also mentioned that 1-inch broadhead cut seemed to be the sweet spot for penetration. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So Dr. Ashby tested a whole range of cutting widths, and what he found was that 1 inch, or slightly wider, up to 1.125 inches, consistently performed best. The narrower broadheads, they just didn't create a wide enough wound channel, which, as we talk about, increases drag, reduces penetration.
Interesting. So it's about finding that balance between having enough cutting surface to reduce drag,
Yeah.
but not so much that it prevents the arrow from penetrating deeply.
Right, and remember, this optimal cutting width was determined based on the incredibly thick hide of the Asian buffalo.
So for animals with less extreme hide thickness, you're probably good with that 1-inch cut.
That's a reasonable conclusion based on the data.
Okay, so we've got smooth, sharp edges for slicing through hide, heavy arrows for maximizing momentum, and a cutting width right around 1 inch. Are we missing anything else when it comes to building the ultimate big game hunting setup?
Well, I think we've covered the core elements here, but there are certainly other factors that contribute to shot lethality, things like arrow shafting, and of course shot placement. Dr. Ashby's research touches on these aspects as well, but maybe we can save those for another deep dive.
Sounds good. I think we've given our listeners plenty to think about already. Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned earlier. You said that each arrow in the study was tested against itself. What did you mean by that?
Oh yeah, that's a great point to clarify. So Dr. Ashby's methodology involved shooting each arrow into the hide multiple times, and then comparing the penetration depth of each shot from that specific arrow. So this way he controlled for any inconsistencies between individual arrows.
Ah, that makes sense. So it's a really rigorous way to isolate the effects of the broadhead and the arrow weight, make sure the results are as accurate as possible.
Exactly. It speaks to the thoroughness of Dr. Ashby's research. He really went above and beyond to produce reliable and insightful data.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the surprising ineffectiveness of serrated edges to the power of momentum and that ideal broadhead cutting width. I think our listeners have a much deeper understanding now of what makes for an effective big game hunting setup.
Yeah, I agree. And the beauty of this research is that it applies across the board. The principles we've discussed today,
Hmm.
they're relevant whether you're hunting elk, deer, bear, or any other big game animal.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to ethical and responsible hunting. Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a question to ponder. If a broadhead and arrow combination can effectively bring down an animal as tough as an Asian buffalo, wouldn't it stand to reason that it would be the optimal choice for less robust animals as well?
That's a great question to consider. And it really gets at the heart of applying scientific research to real-world hunting scenarios.
Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into broadhead lethality for big game. We've uncovered some pretty interesting stuff from Dr. Ashby's research, really challenging some of those common assumptions about what makes a broadhead effective on tough animals.
Yeah, like those serrated edges. Not as great as we thought, huh?
Definitely busted some myths there. And of course, the power of heavy arrows. Who knew?
And let's not forget that ideal cutting width. Right around an inch seems to be the sweet spot.
Yeah, it's all about finding that balance.
Right.
And all of this based on testing with the mighty Asian buffalo.
The toughest of the tough, setting the standard for sure.
Exactly. Now, before we wrap up completely, I wanted to touch on something we mentioned earlier, that Dr. Ashby tested each arrow against itself. Can you quickly explain what that means and why it matters?
Sure, so basically, he shot each arrow into the hide multiple times and compared the penetration depth of each of those shots from that same arrow. So this way, he could control for any differences between individual arrows. Make sure it wasn't just a fluke.
Ah, that makes sense. So it really isolates the variables and ensures those findings are accurate.
Exactly. It's a very rigorous approach, and it speaks to the quality of his research.
Right, he wasn't messing around. Now, we focus mainly on broadhead design and arrow weight today. But obviously, there are other things to consider, like arrow shafting and shot placement. Did Dr. Ashby's research cover those aspects as well?
Absolutely. The report is really comprehensive, covers a wide range of factors, including different arrow shaft materials, and of course, the importance of shot placement.
Okay, so maybe we can save that for another deep dive.
Definitely a lot more to unpack there.
Yeah, but for now, I think we've given our listeners a good grasp of the fundamental principles of broadhead lethality.
And remember, those principles apply across the board to all big game species, whether you're after elk, deer, bear, whatever it may be. Prioritize a smooth, sharp edge, choose heavy arrows for that extra momentum, and aim for that sweet spot of around a 1-inch cut.
Exactly.
Yep.
And it all goes back to that question we posed earlier. If a certain setup can take down something as tough as an Asian buffalo, shouldn't it be equally effective, if not more so, on other less formidable game?
Makes you think, doesn't it? It all comes down to understanding the science behind our gear.
It does. And I think that's the real takeaway here. Dr. Ashby's work gives us the knowledge to make informed decisions about our hunting setups. We're not just choosing things randomly. We're choosing them based on data and real-world testing.
Couldn't agree more. It's about being as effective as possible in the field while upholding those ethical standards.
Well said. So to wrap up our deep dive today, I encourage all our listeners to keep exploring this topic. Dive deeper into Dr. Ashby's research experiment with different setups. Find what works best for you.
Exactly. Knowledge is power. Keep those edges sharp and never stop learning.
And with that, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Until next time. Happy hunting, everyone.